Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. We are Team Global Justice Center. My name is Gina Zuno, and I'm joined with my colleagues Joshua, Sogol, and Paige. And together, we're going to present to you the impact of climate change on sexual and gender-based violence in internally displaced persons in Haiti. The purpose of our research was to analyze the impact of climate change on sexual and gender-based violence in Haiti. Throughout this project, we have assessed sexual and gender-based violence, internal displacement, and the legal and policy frameworks in Haiti in order to guide Global Justice Center's legal and policy advocacy work. Partnering with international organizations and local NGOs, we recommend the Global Justice Center advocate for the following. Recommend mandatory sensitivity training for those involved in the legal process of prosecuting sexual and gender-based violence. Monitor Haiti's compliance with the international human rights treaties, recommend a climate emergency framework, and advocate for further research on trans, non-binary, and gender and sexual minority communities in Haiti. To put this issue into perspective, let's say the example of Noah. When Noah was 15 years old, Hurricane Matthew made landfall in Haiti as a Category 4 hurricane. Noah was forced to evacuate their homes in Lake and sought shelter in an internationally displaced persons camp. While residing in the camp, Noah suffered from sexual harassment, assault, and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence. Noah's experience is not unique. Noah represents the hundreds of thousands of Haitians forced to leave their homes due to natural disasters. Haitians like Noah are at a higher risk of experiencing sexual and gender-based violence in internally displaced persons camps due to instability and a lack of security. To illustrate this problem further, my colleagues will present the various facets of the issue, including sexual and gender-based violence, internal displacement, and the legal and policy framework in Haiti. I will now pass it on to my colleague Paige to talk more in depth about sexual and gender-based violence.
Thank you, Gina. In this section, I'm going to delve deeper into sexual and gender-based violence in Haiti in order to contextualize the ways in which climate change and internal displacement exacerbate the existing sexual and gender-based violence in Haiti. I will first explore the prevalence of sexual and gender-based violence in Haiti. It is reported that 1 in 3 women between the ages of 15 and 49 has experienced some form of SGBV. This includes sexual assault, harassment, violence perpetrated by an intimate partner, and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence. It is difficult to see the full scope of the issue, however, due to widespread underreporting of sexual and gender-based violence. So what causes sexual and gender-based violence and what perpetuates the violence? Through our research, we found that there is a pattern of gender-based discrimination in Haiti, which the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has deemed a constant structural feature in Haitian society and culture. As a result of this, women are systematically excluded from participating in economic and political activities, and sexism and misogyny as forms of gender-based discrimination have become normalized in Haiti. As a result, SGBV, which is just one manifestation of gender-based discrimination, is extremely widespread in Haiti. When seeking justice for sexual and gender-based violence, we found that survivors face barriers at every step of the legal process, from reporting an offense to actually prosecuting the offense. Survivors also face barriers to justice outside of the formal legal process. Survivors face retaliation from perpetrators for speaking openly about their experience of violence or disclosing their assault. Due to these barriers and a lack of resources among Haitian courts, there is a widespread culture of impunity whereby perpetrators can continue to commit SGBV offenses without facing legal consequences. To explore the issue deeper, my colleague Josh will now explore the ways in which climate change and internal displacement exacerbate SGBV.
Thanks, Paige. Internal displacement is a huge challenge for the Haitian people. It is one that is exacerbated by climate change, and it is one that leaves survivors more exposed to SGBV. Haiti currently has the highest total number and highest percentage of internally displaced people in the Americas. The single largest inciting incident of displacement was the 2010 earthquake. However, Haiti is particularly vulnerable to hurricanes, the frequency and intensity of which are worsened by climate change. Additionally, rapidly increasing desertification within the country, another symptom of climate change, makes displacement even worse. Only about 20% of Haitian land is considered arable at this time, which is half of the proportion just 20 years ago. So what we have is a stable or growing displaced population competing over an ever decreasing amount of resources and land. Two inciting incidents in the aftermath of the 2010 earthquake have also significantly reduced social trust in international organizations. The first is the introduction of cholera bacteria from leaf workers, which in a country that lacks proper sanitation and medical infrastructure, quickly became the only cholera epidemic in the world. More than 800,000 people became ill after the introduction of cholera, stressing an already limited healthcare system and immediately casting doubt on the ability of international interventions to help Haitians. The second is well-documented cases of sexual abuse and trafficking by members of international organizations. This fits a consistent pattern of colonial exploitation that Haiti has grappled with for generations. This further weakening of social trust leaves many Haitians convinced that international organizations cannot help the people, making them reluctant to cooperate or access services, and increasingly abscond from formal displacement camps and form what we've termed nomadic displacement communities, or NDCs. These are informal and often fluid groups of displaced people that are difficult, if not impossible, to quantify, study, and deliver food, medicine, and other aid to. These experiences often neglect those of trans and non-binary Haitians. While trans and non-binary people exist within Haiti, social and cultural acceptance, or rather the lack thereof, of these groups leaves most of them in the closet or even further removed from the mechanisms needed to access aid. We found a significant research gap in the experiences of trans and non-binary Haitians to the extent that there almost is no information on the lived experiences, the particular and intersecting challenges faced by people in these communities. Closing that research gap is a crucial element of building a holistic picture of displaced Haitians. Because of the earlier discussed low social trust, informal displacement settings, and challenges around intersectionality, the international community will likely continue to struggle to deliver real aid and change for displaced Haitians. The focus should then be on leveraging the financial weight of organizations and donors, while community and local relief is the focus. Haitians broadly trust other Haitians, and that focus on local-driven relief can be what the country needs. I'd now invite Sogol to talk about the structural gaps in the Haitian judicial system.
Thank you, Josh. So in this section, I'll be discussing the structural gaps within the Haitian judicial system that has led to a weak response to SGBB in Haiti. As noted by my colleague Paige, women and gender minorities are particularly marginalized by the limited access to the justice system, which is for the most part explained by the deeply rooted gender discrimination in the country. The social, political, and economic exclusions that are reinforced by the Haitian judicial system play a huge part in preventing gender minorities from asserting their fundamental rights. We believe the Haitian justice system primarily suffers from structural gaps that are perpetuated by a combination of corruption, lack of access to education, lack of human and financial resources, and a lack of state capacity and political will. The first notable issue that we came across was the issue of corruption in Haiti. Corruption is a significant barrier to justice at different levels of legal proceedings in Haiti. It starts from the investigation stage and the prosecutor's office to intense backlogs, wait times, gender discrimination, and so on. Important to note that corruption came up as a structural gap throughout almost all of our interviews. The next issue brought to our attention was the lack of access to education. Sexual and gender-based violence in Haiti is inextricably linked with poverty, which in sorry, I'm not sure why I was muted. Which in turn leads to Haitians, especially women and minority groups, being systematically deprived of basic needs such as education and access to justice. To most Haitians without education or a stable income, the ability to use the legal system to enforce their right is an abstract concept. In that respect, Haiti's judicial system reflects a culture of exclusion and impunity that makes it difficult for individuals like Noah to access justice. The next issue we'll be discussing is the lack of human and financial resources. The 2010 earthquake in Haiti destroyed 27 out of 28 national government buildings, including the Ministry of Justice, and killed more than 20% of Haiti's civil servants. So in general, since the earthquake, there's been an inadequate number of Haitian police relative to the overall population. Therefore, there's a need for trained police officers, especially sensitized and specialized officers, to hear SGBV complaints. On top of that, there's a lack of forensic scientists as well as equipment to document and investigate cases of SGBV. Another resource issue is legal costs and lawyers that are too expensive for the majority of Haitians. So again, survivors like Noah refrain from asking for legal assistance and are left with limited access to a formal justice system. The last but not least resource issue is the police and judges' low salaries and insufficient training that make honest practice difficult for civil servants in Haiti. And that takes us to the next issue, which is lack of state capacity and political will. Based on our interviews, it seems like there are notable gaps both in the laws and their enforcement. However, the Haitians seem to be suffering more from the poor enforcement of existing laws rather than the absence of them. And this is again explained by the deeply rooted cultural discrimination against gender minorities in Haiti. Most often, SGBV cases are not a priority for administrators of justice, so survivors like Noah are either not taken seriously or are disrespected during the procedural investigations, and therefore their cases are not investigated adequately. So these structural barriers have compromised the capacity of the Haitian government to enforce the law and has prevented the government of Haiti to attend to their international human rights commitments. Now there's been extensive local and global initiatives to address the issues around SGBV in Haiti. To name a few, at the global level, there's been the UN Interagency Standing Committee that mobilized clusters consisting of UN agencies, NGOs, and other international organizations that work together to provide humanitarian assistance to Haitians, and within those clusters, the gender-based violence subcluster was specifically designed to address SGBV issues. At the local level, there's been Haitian grassroots organizations that were created to support women and gender minorities who had been suffering from cultural and political violence. However, the majority of these initiatives and programs in place suffer from Haiti's exclusionary legal system, a lack of a participatory approach, as well as a lack of coordination among international and local organizations. Throughout our research, we found that gender minorities are rarely, if at all, included in post-disaster needs assessments. The plannings of SGBV activities and even have difficulty accessing and benefiting from the programs in place. So in order to ensure the effectiveness and sustainability of the relief programs, there's a special need for truly engaging the impacted groups in creation of these programs. In addition to that, it is important to have systems and structures in place that facilitate coordination among the international and local organizations. With that in mind, I'm going to pass it back to my colleague, Gina.
Thank you, Sogol. Throughout our research, we have seen that climate change exacerbates sexual and gender-based violence in Haiti by forcing Haitians to leave their homes and seek shelter in internally displaced persons camps or non-nomadic camps. Sexual assaults go unreported, and survivors of sexual and gender-based violence have difficulty seeking justice for those offenses due to structural barriers in the Haitian judicial system. In order to address sexual and gender-based violence in Haiti and help survivors like Noah seek justice, we recommend the Global Justice Center advocate for mandatory sensitivity training for officers of the judicial police, physicians, and lawyers in Haiti. Monitor Haiti's compliance with the international human rights treaties it has ratified, modify local law in compliance with the international treaties. Recommend a climate emergency framework that prepares Haitian society for future disasters, with a specific emphasis on relief for groups most vulnerable to sexual and gender-based violence. And lastly, advocate for further research to close knowledge gaps on trans, non-binary, and other gender and sexual minorities communities in Haiti. It is imperative for Global Justice Center to understand the scope of the issue on the ground and work closely with international organizations and local NGOs to recommend these strategies. Implementing this framework will guide the Global Justice Center legal and policy advocacy efforts, and it will help with their work. We would like to thank our client for their support and guidance over the last 7 to 8 months for this project, and also our faculty leads, Ketty and Erin. and we welcome any questions at this time. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate that presentation. And I'm now going to ask Grant for some comments or questions to begin this part of the program. So is Grant there? There, great, excellent.
Thank you. I trust you all can hear me fine. That the transition went smoothly. Great, thanks. Well, thank you so much. That was extremely enlightening and obviously very high quality piece of work that is something that we at GJC have been extremely excited about for the duration of the project. So thank you for the opportunity to be the client, and thank you for this very high quality piece of work product. You know, one of the reasons why we were keen on understanding these issues with a little bit more depth is that it seems as if to us an organization that works specifically on achieving human rights and more specifically global gender equality through the rule of law, using international legal norms, precedents, conventions, laws to create gender equality and make sure that gender equality and equal protection of the law is something that's enjoyed all over the world. One of the reasons why we were keen on this project was because we're very interested in looking at the emerging challenges and issues facing the world, and in particular, and not least of which, of course, is climate change. So I gather from the students that, you know, this part wasn't, I don't know that it was explicitly a conclusion of the report, but over our conversations, I think in this presentation, it makes quite clear that the existing legal and policy frameworks and practices in Haiti are dismally short of being prepared to accommodate the anticipated dual crises of access to justice for sexual and gender-based violence, the occurrence of sexual and gender-based violence, and the additional, how do you say, risks to human rights presented by climate change. We are in the process of trying to figure out, or the Global Justice Center is in the process of trying to better figure out how to tackle these issues. And I think that your report does an extremely proficient and clear job at making particular recommendations. One thing that we discussed over the course of the project, and I would be keen to hear the students' perceptions now, is where might be the best place to begin, to the extent that GJC made a conclusion that this was a particular policy priority that we wanted to pursue, in beginning to investigate how to better have Haitian policy reflect their international human rights and legal obligations. And I'm thinking specifically about partnering with on-the-ground groups. I know we had lots of discussions about the lack of visibility of the LGBTQ populations in Haiti and the challenges of visibility. And so I would be curious to hear what practical, specific next steps might you consider beyond the existing recommendations, or maybe more practical than the recommendations. The recommendations would be policy recommendations, but more practically, how would you go about animating, creating some of those recommendations, specifically as it relates to putting rubber to the road on some of those acts?
Yeah, thanks, Grant. So I'll maybe give my thoughts, and I'm sure that the rest of my team has thoughts as well. The one thing that was overriding in all of our research and our interviews that we conducted was a very real lack of trust and a very deep cynicism towards anything that the Haitian government tries to do. But much higher levels of trust in local organizations, particularly in urban centers like Port-au-Prince. And as to the point that trans and non-binary folks don't generally have an organized community, the one area where we do see some organization is in women's rights groups, women's shelters, and women's female-driven civil society organizations within the urban centers of Haiti. And so that would be, in my opinion, the starting point. These are the most effective civil service organizations and NGOs in country. and they are the ones that are broadly trusted by the population most threatened by climate change and by SGBV. State to state conversations and even, you know, GJC to state conversations are a very conventional approach that I don't think will work. The very sort of grassroots organizations are the only ones with any kind of civil trust, and so they're the only ones that are going to have any kind of buy-in from the people that would need the help.
Yeah, another thing that we came across in all of our interviews with Haitian organizations is that if an international or any other organization that wants to enter Haiti, they would like to talk to them first. So the first thing would be talk to the people, talk to the local organizations and see what they need, because sometimes they just give their opinion or give their recommendations without asking for their needs. And I think that's something that was repeated in, if not all of our interviews throughout. And I think that's very important, that the local knowledge be acknowledged.
If I could jump in here and just echo some of my colleagues and thank Grant for that great question. In our interviews, we saw, as my colleagues have said, that building trust is really of the utmost importance here. So anything that can be done to build trust among Haitians is paramount. And in an interview with Brian Kincannon, who's one of the leading legal scholars on prosecuting sexual violence in Haiti, we found that really putting a focus on empowering survivors of sexual violence is extremely important as well. So what I would recommend is partnering with international organizations, absolutely, but also those local NGOs doing the work on the ground and promoting survivor empowerment and also just building trust that way.
Just to echo what my colleagues mentioned, aside from the fact that most of the Haitian government doesn't get to do much because of their resource constraint for the most part. The fundings and resources, most of them come from the donor states. That said, the way these fundings are being used are also usually kind of guided by these global organizations. So what came up throughout our interviews was that there is definitely a need to include the local organizations in this. So that's just something to take note of as well. But thank you so much.
Great, thanks for that discussion with Grant. Let me now bring in the two faculty advisors, Erin Baines and Ketty and Anyeko, to ask some questions or make some comments. And Ketty, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you very much, Team Global Justice Center, for the great work that you've done. And I don't really have specific questions with regards to your content of the presentation because it's amazing, it's great. The question I have is with regards to researching and writing about difficult subjects. In this current world where we are experiencing pandemics, SGBV is the order of the day, wars, and so on. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on how you took care of yourselves as researchers in these scenarios, because as someone who has been, in research, action research for a long time, that's one area where researchers usually forget to take care of their own well-being. So what were some of the strategies you used in moving past the difficulty of the data that you were dealing with and the results that you're trying to write about? I mean, hearing that 1 in 3 women get sexually abused in Haiti, or that they hardly have permanent homes to live in. I mean, these are difficult issues to write and to research about. So how did you approach that?
Thank you for that question, Ketty. I can jump in and say that our faculty advisors, so Ketty and Erin, were incredible supports throughout this entire process. And Erin especially gave us the insight and the tip to just prioritize our own mental health through this process. So I would start by thanking both of you. It is a very difficult topic, and it was difficult hearing those lived experiences. Noah is the composite person out of all of those experiences. Noah's experience is not unique, but it was extremely difficult to deal with the data. And I would, welcome my colleagues to jump in as well.
Certainly, yeah, I would say there were two keys. And the first was the four of us have actually been in classes in both semesters together. Both those classes were with Erin. So we've developed a really excellent working relationship that I think we all trust each other on a level that I maybe wasn't expecting coming into the project. And certainly getting to know Erin and Ketty through class as well as this project really helped with that. And then also, finding ways to turn it into motivation. That absolutely, this is hard work and these are difficult papers to read. These are difficult interviews to conduct, but the difficulty is the point, and the difficulty is why it's worthwhile. These are people that through a variety of circumstances have been harmed. And if in the work that we're doing, we're able to alleviate a little bit of that harm, then yes, is it hard to read the paper? It is, but it's also probably worth it.
Great, thanks. Let me ask Erin to jump in now.
Awesome job, team. That was just like so sharp, so well presented, and really great responses to the questions so far. I'm just going to ask you to maybe push yourselves a little bit more in complicating community. So important points on community held knowledge, but we also know community can be sites of violence and exclusion, right? And that discrimination against persons on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity often begins within the home and within the community, leave alone the institutions and structures. So, and given the silences that you've identified in Haiti, what are some of the ways that you can open, or people could open spaces so there is an increased visibility and a trust, even just within community, for people to be able to begin to share their story and begin to seek recognition within these various legal processes? Big question, just don't have to answer it, but I thought I'd leave that there.
Anybody have any comments?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think one of the main problems with the issues that you brought up, Erin, is that Haiti is a very patriarchal society still, and it's very too gender-based. But there are some local organizations that we found through our research for the transgender community. We have a bunch for women, children, but I think that if the community starts accepting other minorities within their own circles, which is very hard to do in a very patriarchal society, and coming myself from a very patriarchal society, I can see how that is very tough even to get your community support and your communities back. But I do think that having just this organization, even if it's just for transgender people, I think that opens a bunch of different doors. But I think it's very hard, and I don't know if that answers the question, but I think it's going to be a process, and it's going to be a process very, very long and very hard, because even when we're doing our research, we found that rights for women were just a couple of years ago put into their penal code, and rape was actually not even penalized. So even that has been years and years of work, and I do think that society has been working on it, but it's just, I don't think there's an answer to that question as of yet for me. I don't know if my colleagues have something to say.
Well, go ahead, Sogol, real quick, because we're running out of time.
Say that just to echo what Gina was mentioning, and also the fact that the women's movements, the grassroots women's organizations are doing such an amazing job with the awareness campaigns. This is what Gina was talking about. Just was going to echo that. But thank you so much, Erin, for everything. And Ketty, thank you.